perspective of Brooks Spector. He's the associate editor at Daily Maverick. Thank you very much for availing yourself. I think maybe firstly, let's start with the so-called rebel republics of Daniesk and Luhansk. What do we need to know about them?
Well, what we need to know in brief is that they are on the border, virtually, of Ukraine and Russia. They consist of largely Russian-speaking, but not necessarily entirely ethnic Russian inhabitants. But by the same token, for the last number of years, insurgent separatists in both of those areas have been waging obviously a civil war and insurrection against the Ukrainian government entirely. And what this has now done, something along the lines of what your Durko minister mentioned, it's provoked the beginning of the imposition of various levels of sanctions. From the U.S. side last night, there are now sanctions against those two rebel regions that the Putin government has recognized as quote-unquote independent nations. So there are now economic sanctions against institutions, organizations, and individuals in those two areas, and preventing any Americans from doing business with any of them. What it is doing is that it is also creating a pathway for Russian military forces to enter what was Ukrainian territory. Although a footnote to all of that, of course, is that there have been Russian forces in those areas since the insurgencies began, except that they were not in full uniform and didn't have their insignia and identifications, so there was plausible deniability. The problem for Ukraine, of course, is that none of its borders really are natural borders. There are no oceans, effectively. There are no major mountain ridges and huge defining rivers that create the borders. And so the country is open in many ways to border changes by invasions, in this case by what is now 190,000 Russian military personnel, as well as naval units in the Black Sea. So that's kind of where we are right now, although the last bits of news that I saw just a few minutes ago was that the Germans have now postponed certifying the Newzroom 2 natural gas pipeline that had been completed but had not yet been certified, and that the Russians were hoping would be able to send natural gas to Germany as a major currency earner and as a supplier to Germany of fuel. With this in hand, the circumstances do not necessarily make it look like the Russian government gamed out all the events and all the possibilities completely, and now they're beginning to discover there are consequences.
The provocation that you speak of resulting in sanctions, is it warranted? You just painted a picture of the terrain and the ease of access in terms of entering into Ukraine, but Vladimir Putin has not done that.
Well, I mean, the Putin position has been fairly clear and was demonstrated rather terrifyingly last night in his speech to the Russian people. He spoke for about an hour or so live, apparently without notes and without an entirely clear, consistent message. But his underlying theme was that Ukraine is not a real country. It's simply a stalking horse for the West and a lever to help destroy Russia. And Ukrainians now, more than ever before, think of themselves as a clear, definable ethnicity and independent nation. And so I think it's fair to say that the Russians have now created the very thing that they fear. Footnote again here, there's no plan that is public in any way that would easily bring Ukraine into NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Western nations. There's no plan so far to bring Ukraine into the European Union. And there's certainly a zero plan to send American troops into Ukraine to support its struggle against what might well be Russian invasion routes into its country. So the chimera that the Russian president created last night on television is just that. It's not believable, and he's going to now have a very difficult time trying to figure out ways to make his truth the believable truth for everybody else.
What is the United States' truth in this matter, if you will? What is in it for them? We've seen, some school of thought saying, well, the Russian president or Russia, the country, has only shown off what they are capable of in terms of the arsenal at their disposal, in terms of the troops at their disposal.
Well, I mean, the truth on the ground, of course, now is that there are close to 200,000 Russian military personnel in a three-quarter circle around the country. They are already sending in troop columns and vehicle columns, tanks and armored personnel carriers into those two so-called independent mini-states, and none of the troops that surround the country, the Russian troops that surround Ukraine, have been withdrawn, pulled back, or sent back to bases. As far as the United States is concerned, as I understand it, the argument's very simple. Ukraine is a democratic society, increasingly looking to build relations with its near neighbors to the west, and that any effort to subvert that or conquer it or divide it or pressure it from another place is tantamount to interference across an internationally recognized border. The problem and the real challenge for the United States and the rest of the West is if the Russians choose in a number of ways to engage in what is now called hybrid warfare. That is, yes, there are military, but there are also cyber attacks. There have been a couple of those, and maybe those were just premonitions or warnings of what could be done. But a cyber attack on a modern society can do terrible things to all of the connected networks that we live with, whether it be electricity or communications or banking or any of the rest. A hybrid attack would also include creating the false narratives that lead to creating a reason for you to attack another. And so that's kind of where we stand now. What you haven't seen is any weakening of resolve by any of the NATO nations at this point. And that, I think, is a particularly significant development, and one that I don't think the Russians adequately expected would occur. I think they thought that they could fairly easily divide NATO nations into those that want to press for harder sanctions and those that want to say, now wait just a minute, let's see how things play out. What this has also done, of course, is that to a considerable degree, this draws to an end diplomatic efforts to forestall the crisis from happening in the first place. It's going to be a lot harder going forward to carry forward the idea that diplomacy is the path out of this mess.
If you're following developments around the story, it's quite anxiety-inducing, if you will. Every single day we're hearing reports of any minute now Russia, could attack Ukraine. I guess for somebody that's sitting in Timbuktu, of what significance is this? Why does it matter?
Well, it matters in a couple of ways, and I mean, if you follow my argument here, you could easily say, well, Ukraine is 9 or 10,000 kilometers away from me. What does it matter? I went shopping 2 weeks ago at a sale of summer clothing, tried on a couple of pairs of men's trousers, and it turns out they were made in Ukraine under contract to a German manufacturer. There are lots of plants, lots of factories in Ukraine making Western quality goods under contract. But much more important than that are several other features of the economic world. One is this really can disrupt foreign exchange expectations. And we all know that the rand is a particularly volatile currency. It reacts very quickly to international disruptions and disturbances. But even more important than that, it turns out, and this was something I only learned relatively recently, Ukraine is the fourth largest grain exporter to the world. And many of the countries that buy its grain are fragile, almost failing states in some cases, who find Ukrainian grain is crucial for feeding the populations of those countries. Once that grain is pulled off the market because it can't be delivered or because there's fighting or whatever reason, it augurs the possibility that in places like Lebanon and various African nations, there will be food shortages or price rises. It's also going to have another knock-on effect, which we discount too easily. It's going to further increase the cost of fuel, whether it be petroleum, natural gas. This will be yet another effect of the disruption of the trading network. Much natural gas already goes through Ukraine to Western Europe. So if you're living in Timbuktu or if you're living in Mpumalanga, you have reason to be concerned on purely economic terms, putting aside everything else.
Brooks Spector, Associate Editor at Daily Maverick and a retired American diplomat. A pleasure. Thank you.